What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the new movie, The King of Staten Island, written by and starring SNL alum Pete Davidson. He had some help with the script by Dave Sears and Judd Apatow, and Judd Apatow also directed the movie, and 20 years deep into his directing career, this is kind of what Judd Apatow does now. He helps comedic talent launch their movie careers, as he's done in the past with Steve Carell, Seth Rogen, Amy Schumer, the list goes on and on. And it's interesting seeing a movie as high profile as this skip the theatrical window entirely and go straight to video on demand. It seems like that's going to be the trend moving forward, where the big, giant $200 million movies are still going to play in theaters and try to put butts in seats, get all that ticket revenue. But it seems like these movies in the mid-budget range, like King of Staten Island, are going to very quickly find a home more often than not on Amazon, Netflix, so on and so forth. But for people who don't know, this is a really personal film for Pete Davidson because it's loosely based on his own life. Pete Davidson lost his father at the age of 7. His father, Scott, was one of the first responders in 9/11. He was a firefighter who lost his life. And in this movie, his character's named after his father, Scott. And the character Scott absolutely adored his father. He thought he was just the coolest guy ever. So ever since then, he's really struggled to get his life up and running. He's got an aversion to commitment in relationships. He never finished high school. He doesn't have a job. He still lives with his mom, played by Marissa Tomei. And once Scott's sister goes off to school, it becomes readily apparent to everybody that Scott needs to kind of get his shit together and start actually doing something with his life, especially once Marissa Tomei meets and falls in love with another fireman played by the great Bill Burr. Bill Burr's character's name is Ray. And initially, Scott and Ray are just absolutely locking horns. But slowly but surely, over the course of the movie, through Ray, Scott's able to get to know all the people who work at the local fire department, and getting to know this circle of friends kind of serves as a catalyst to help the character of Scott decide that he wants to finally grow up. And there's plenty about this overall structure that's going to seem a little tired and formulaic. After all, Saturday Night Live alumni have been using this formula for decades at this point. I mean, just look at Tommy Boy or Billy Madison. But I was really curious about this movie going into it because I'm a massive Bill Burr fan, and I am genuinely curious to see what direction Pete Davidson's career is going to take. At this point, I kind of know what the Judd Apatow brand or flavor or formula is, and slowly but surely, I'm liking Judd Apatow's movies less and less. But Pete Davidson's kind of this wild, crazy, unpredictable new talent, and I think this movie shows the potential for an incredible career. But reviewing this movie critically obviously puts people in a really strange place, because if you criticize it at all, you can come across as a bit of a son of a bitch, because this is such a personal film about what's clearly an open wound for Pete Davidson. And there's a lot about this movie that's really heartwarming to watch, in particular in the latter part of the film. But the movie does have its flaws, and I am going to call attention to them. So I'm going to break my review into two pieces. I'm going to open with all the things that I thought worked great, all the good, and then toward the end of the review, I'm going to kind of rip it a new one and call attention to what I thought was a lot of the bad. So let's start with the flavors and ingredients that I thought worked particularly well. The cast was absolutely first rate. As I said before, Pete Davidson, he's just this expressive maniac with all this incredible, unpredictable energy. He spends most of the movie smoking weed with his crazy friends, some of whom are pretty damn funny in their own right. But where this movie really shines is with Bill Burr and Steve Buscemi. Steve Buscemi is particularly good. I mean, at this point, Steve Buscemi should be regarded as a national treasure. Between his own films he's directed, with movies like Trees Lounge, or his performances in movies by the Coen brothers and things like Fargo, or more recently, really cool shows like Boardwalk Empire. But Steve Buscemi is one of my all-time favorite actors. I've been following him for decades. And toward the end of the film, he really brings the heat and shows off his dramatic chops, something that's kind of lacking in the rest of the film. But Bill Burr, who's one of my all-time favorite comedians, and I love watching his stuff, this is probably the best acting we've seen from him. Obviously, he's been popping up in tons of stuff like Breaking Bad, and I thought he was really good in The Mandalorian as well. He was absolutely fantastic. But it's clear as a dramatic performer, Bill Burr is definitely entering a new phase in his career where his range is expanding. And also, for a movie that had surprisingly little comedy, considering the talent involved, some of the funniest scenes by far were those involving Bill Burr. But as I mentioned before, I think the strongest scenes are toward the end of the film, and what really won me over were all these bonding scenes between all the firemen that Pete Davidson's character slowly but surely gets to know, where they're telling all these wild and crazy stories about his dad back in the day, or when they're all just drunkenly singing along to the song One Headlight by the Wallflowers. I have to admit, I was nothing but smiles, and even got a few chills. But another thing I like about this movie is that it fleshes out a corner of New York. And I have to confess, I lived in New York for 12 years now. I've never even been to Staten Island, probably because it's a giant pain in the ass to get over there, but I think I owe it to myself at this point to at least take a day and go over there and explore it. And while I was surprised at how little comedy there was in this 2-hour, 17-minute movie, I will admit that it passed the infamous 6-laugh test that was created by film critic Mark Kermode. Mark Kermode's one of my favorite film historians, but he judges most comedies by whether or not you laugh involuntarily 6 times or more. And I was actually keeping track while I was taking notes, and it more than passed the 6-laugh test. However, anytime you've got one of the brightest new talents on SNL, combined with one of my favorite stand-up comedians, combined with a director like Judd Apatow. He's made a lot of comedies. I'm expecting to laugh more than I did, but I'll get to that in the bad section of my review. But continuing with the good, I'm more invested now in Pete Davidson as a writer and a performer than I was prior to seeing this movie. He's not Al Pacino, but he's not trying to be. But this movie does show that he's not afraid to try and stretch his range, stretch his muscles as an actor, go into uncomfortable territory. But I'm hoping that whatever he does next just has a little bit more teeth, just a bit more of a bite to it. But perhaps that's just because my taste in comedy tends to be a little bit more provocative. Also, quick side note, I should have mentioned this before when I was talking about how much I love Steve Buscemi. He actually was a New York City firefighter long before becoming a full-time professional actor. And after the tragedy of 9/11, Steve Buscemi actually returned to his old fire station to help his friends look for survivors in the rubble of the World Trade Center. Once again, as I said before, Steve Buscemi, he's a national treasure. And I think that's what gives this movie a little extra oomph when you're watching this one scene where the character Scott goes out on his first call. And he's watching everybody in action, and you can tell he's really inspired by the bravery and self-sacrifice of these firemen in action. And the scene did give me a few chills, which is not something that I can write off lightly. I was just hoping for more jokes like Pamela Adlon, who's an incredible comedic performer. She's on a ton of things like Louie, but she was funny as hell in this, but was criminally underused. The best laugh of the movie was when she's describing her mommy time and how sometimes mommy needs to drink when the kids are away. In any event, I wish she got a lot more work in shows and movies. But let's move on to the bad. As I mentioned before, this movie is excessively long. You will feel the length. It is 2 hours and 17 minutes, and it does not earn that length. It could have easily been 45 minutes shorter without sacrificing any of the heart, any of the comedy. At about the halfway point, I completely turned against this movie and thought that I was going to absolutely rip it a new one in my review because there's just no sense of urgency in the story. It's an incredibly slack, lazy story structure, and there's just so few jokes. I started thinking to myself, why am I watching this? But once again, as I mentioned before, the movie does have a lot of heart toward the end, and so I had to kind of dial back some of my animosity toward this movie. But the reality is it took me about 30 minutes before I had my first big belly laugh where I was cracking up at something happening in the film. And that's a bad sign, once again, when you got Pete Davidson, Bill Burr, and Judd Apatow all collaborating. And another thing I found to be kind of tired and formulaic is that this is just yet another story about a man boy who refuses to grow up, constantly throwing temper tantrums. Everybody's always kind of coddling him and looking after him. And the tough love scenes from the adults like Marissa Tomei and Bill Burr eventually come. But I was getting real tired of his childish temper tantrums before people finally put him in his place with some good old-fashioned ritualistic hazing by making him do all the shit work at the fire department or blasting him out of bed with a fire hose. But the biggest negative for me are all the signs of fatigue in the directing style of Judd Apatow. While watching this, you can tell he would be much better off just producing tons of shows and movies. He's been incredibly successful in the comedy genre. But if you compare something like this to his early work, whether you're talking about shows like Freaks and Geeks and Undeclared, or a movie like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, his more recent movies like Trainwreck and The King of Staten Island, they just feel so vanilla and soft and toothless and nauseatingly sentimental at times. And perhaps that's just a sign of his age because as people get older, they do get more sentimental, they do get more nostalgic. But it feels like he's increasingly averse to any situation or any moment that might possibly upset or offend anyone. Whereas in the 40-Year-Old Virgin, you had all kinds of wild, untamed comedy that was absolutely delightful to watch. I saw that movie several times over. And I should also acknowledge that I've got a bit of a negative personal bias towards Judd Apatow because I don't like his public persona, at least when it comes to social media. And the most glaring example of that is when he started Twitter shaming Sony for financing Quentin Tarantino's latest movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a movie that ended up becoming my favorite movie of 2019. And if Judd Apatow doesn't like Tarantino or he's got personal beef with him, more power to him. But I don't think it's the job of directors to go on social media and try and shame studios for working with one of the most beloved directors working today. And it seems like from Judd Apatow's point of view, the only shows and movies that should get made are those that he approves of, and that is an attitude that I'm completely opposed to. But now I'm running the risk of getting just as smug and self-righteous as Judd Apatow, so I'm going to wrap it up. I think people will enjoy this movie. I just don't think people will love this movie. I think a lot of people will probably cry toward the end of it. I think people will be caught off guard by how little comedy there is, and I think people will be caught off guard by just how long it feels. But if you're a Judd Apatow fan, it's well worth watching. If you're a Pete Davidson fan, well worth watching. And if you like Marissa Tomei and Bill Burr and Steve Buscemi and all these other marvelous character actors who are in it, then it's absolutely worth watching. It is a very watchable movie. The best way I can describe it is if this movie had come out in the 90s and we were walking through the video store and we were looking at movies considering to rent, if I'd seen Billy Madison or Tommy Boy on the wall, I would have told my friends absolutely funny as hell, definitely check it out. But with King of Staten Island, I may be like, I don't know if I'd recommend it. I enjoyed the movie, but in no way, shape, or form is going to be added to the list of my favorite vehicles starring the alumni of Saturday Night Live. In any event, I think this is one of those take it or leave it scenarios where if the trailer grabs you, definitely check it out. And if not, you can probably move on and check out something else. But I hope you enjoyed this reaction review. Please consider subscribing to my channel, hitting that notification bell, liking the video, all the good stuff. And if you want to talk more, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.